Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about album number 12 from Tangerine Dream, White Eagle. I'm gonna be honest, I don't really remember this one. When I was in high school, I know I went through all the TD projects in their Virgin Records era, and I must have heard this album at least once, but just like Force Majeure, it never stuck. I probably heard it once and then just never came back to it. There were albums that came out after this one that did stick a lot more and I have a lot more vivid memories of, but this one, nothing. I have no recollection of it. Now, I have seen a lot of excitement from fans and a number of people in the comment sections of my other recent TD reviews talking about how they hold this album up as a big favorite and still a demonstration of their peak era. And hey, Force Majeure was astronomically better than I remembered coming back to that album to review it, leaving me genuinely confused as to how that album could have left so little of an impression when I was in high school. Coming back to White Eagle and hearing that album now for the first time in over a solid decade, it had me like, that's why I don't remember any of this. It's just not very memorable to begin with. Okay, in one breath, I do hear all the same styles of synth sequences and drum machines that made albums like Tangerine and Exit as exciting for me as they still are. It's got all the same ingredients that made those albums work, that same 80s proto-techno sound. It doesn't feature any new sounds you haven't heard from them before, or any new leaps forward in sound. I think I did see an interview where Edgar Fruza marked this album as the first one of theirs to use a digital sampler, but if that's the case, I'm not really hearing the difference. But hey, it's not like they're sticking to a sound that hasn't already proven to work and produce multiple bona fide classics. Not to mention the tracks themselves in theory show a little bit of a return to the more open-ended jam session style of their pre-Exit work. There's a 20-minute track here and a 9-minute track sitting next to two other tracks that try to go for that tighter Exit formula and sit around much quicker 4-minute running times. It feels like they were trying to continue to modernize their sound, trying to combine what worked about an album like Exit with what worked about their earlier material, make a project that was more indicative of their usual style while still getting it to feel contemporary. I can see how that could work and why this would still hit for people who were big fans of their Exit and Tangerine era stuff. I'm not really sure if they really got there in practice, though. By my ears, this is a combination of the approaches of albums like Exit with their earlier work that features the weaknesses of both and the strengths of neither. It's going for a simpler and more straightforward sound like Exit, but it doesn't have any of that album's tightness or its all-time classic hooks. As I mentioned in my review of that album, those hooks are a particular strength which would never be repeated in the same way again on another album of theirs. But at the same time, in trying to split the difference between that simpler sound with the more open-ended jam session feel, we just get compositions that kinda meander without ever really going anywhere interesting. There's not enough texture or depth to these mixes to pull me in, like albums such as Force Majeure, Tangerine, or Rubicon, or any number of others. That could theoretically leave this album open to hit in the same way as something like Stratosphere, where it's very dry and minimalistic and open-ended, but can still really effectively hit, thanks to how well planned out its pacing and compositions are. But White Eagle doesn't really have that either. These compositions give me more the feeling that like they were kind of composed on the fly. The sound may be fuller, but they do a lot less to actually keep me interested. And I don't even know if the fuller sound is even that much of a strength over Stratosphere, since that album's thinner and drier sound gave it more of a distinct flavor. I feel like all my biggest problems with this project can be pretty well summed up by the 20-minute opening track, Mojave Plan. Things start out innocently enough, with the brief abstract intro of minimal clicking noises covered in reverb echoing out in the distance, and with a bunch of abstract amelodic pads coming in kinda like the beginning of Force Majeure. It's nice, but eventually a solid groove starts to form, some bass lines and synth riffs fade in, and then it hits me. This is literally just Charanzon again. The drum patterns, the keyboard riffs, everything is almost exactly identical to that track, just with the hook taken out and replaced with various meandering synth solos carrying on for the entire next 10 minutes. When this section first came up on my first return listen for this video, I remember saying out loud, "Are you fucking kidding me?" It may be true that Taranzan is probably my personal favorite Tangerine Dream track, but this takes the core element of that track that made it such an eternal classic, the lead melodic hooks. It takes that out and just doesn't really do anything else with the rest. And they rip themselves off again for the intro of the next section, which has all this clicking percussion that just sounds like that one part of Tangram Set 1. The last 9 minutes of the track do kinda salvage things. There's a new groove and tune form that just kind of generically sounds like other stuff from Tangram and Exit without such specific connections to earlier moments in their catalog. And there's a cool, like, chaotic string outro right at the end. It's nice, but man was it rough to hear these guys just rip themselves off so shamelessly on what is presented to be this grand 20-minute opener of a full-on new album. And it feels like so little of interest is really happening over the course of that time. I mean, the solos are fine, but they mostly just sound like deja vu from that run of their last couple of albums. Compared to, like, this stuff on Tangram, which felt like it had a whole bunch of, like, 7 different sections, lots of different stuff happening. This has, like, 2 sections. And the track just feels kind of dry and barren compositionally. Maybe that was meant to be kind of the point, given the track is called Mojave Plan. But it's not dry and barren sonically. It doesn't evoke a desert kind of mood, really. It's just a very plain and kind of redundant take on sounds you've already heard from them before. Now, given TD's usual pattern of the first side nearly always being more interesting than the second side, that really doesn't bode well for what's to come. Although, to be fair, this album does thankfully break that pattern. The opener's actually probably my least favorite track here, and the second side does give me more to latch on to. First there's Midnight in Tula, the album's shortest track at under 4 minutes, and the most Exit-like in its conception, with a fast-paced, Kraftwerky dance beat, and some lively synth riffs, do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do. Also ends up flowing out of the opener decently well to boot. But the tune is kinda goofy and undercooked, especially compared to the similar stuff on their last album. The groove, while decently danceable, does feel a little thin, and the melody feels like a prototype for something that ought to be turned into a more full-fledged track. My first return listen of this had me like, well, that was kinda lame, but it did marginally grow on me the more time I spent with it. The second longer piece, Convention of the 24, is nice enough too, once again letting various solos come and go over a single repeating bass sequence that carries over 10 minutes. I mean, it's no through metamorphic rocks, but it'll do in a pinch. There's not a lot of forward momentum, but there is just some nice tension built with it, and will do well once again for people hungering for the band to just jam out some more and for something more cosmic and open-ended to lay back to. And the album saves easily its best track for last in the title track. A very pretty little mix of cascading synth melodies layering over each other and building up quite nicely, creating a very airy and peaceful vibe that still fits well with the futuristic 80s vibes of all their other material from this era. They apparently even repurposed this track into a theme tune for an episode of a German cop show, retitled Das Mädchen auf der Treppe. But yeah, that's kind of everything that White Eagle gives me to break down. There's just not a lot here. I know I may have sounded like I'm being pretty harsh to this album, but I mean, to be absolutely fair, I don't think it's a bad album by any stretch. And I do get why it would still have its fans. Apparently some of the people who were initially turned off by the poppiness of an album like Exit were won back by this album, which restructured a lot of the same ideas to appeal more to the listening style they were used to. And that is fair. Again, they're sticking to a formula that works, and in 1982, this was still technically cutting edge. Like, the albums they're rehashing put them ahead enough of the curve where they could still get away with kind of just rotely doing them again, and even if the world of electronic music was expanding a fair bit by the time this project rolled around, it's not like there were a lot of other people around putting out, like, these kind of long-winded, all-instrumental synth projects in this particular style. It's perfectly inoffensive and listenable, even in its worst moments. My least favorite cut here does still recapture the groove of my favorite TD track, even if possibly kind of missing the point of it. And if you ignore all those better classic albums like Stratosphere, Tangram, Exit, or the album they came out with right after this one, which can do these sounds better and a lot more interestingly, White Eagle certainly isn't doing the sound poorly. It's a perfectly fine album in a vacuum. It's also neither grown nor shrunk on me the longer I've sat with it for this video. I saw one commenter on my exit review claim that that was the last album he thought was worth hearing from this band at all, and that everything afterwards was pretty much just a weaker attempt to recapture what worked on Exit. And I don't personally agree with that sentiment. I think there was still more quality yet to come after this point that doesn't just sit within that album's shadow. But maybe in the case of this one particular album, yeah, that is kind of a fair assessment. It's still a decent enough effort with enough value to still be a generally fun listen in the background. It's more of the proto-techno sound they could be counted on to do well. And, I mean, obviously there's no crime in not being a game-changing classic like those old projects this does sit within the shadow of. The fact that I've had Exit all but burned into my mind for over a decade and have only just started to get into this album now definitely isn't working to this album's benefit. It's probably going to be a lot easier to excuse for people who maybe had this as a jumping on point to get into the band, or otherwise just have more nostalgia for it. But coming from a band whose catalog thus far has always been about moving forward, this is the first one that feels like a step backwards. The first one to neither introduce any new ideas they hadn't tried before, nor further refine any old ones. The first red flag, which might signal the eventual fall-off in the latter half of the decade might be coming, is not their unofficial death knell by any stretch. That honor goes to Tiger in 1987. But out of all the 12 Tangerine Dream albums I've now reviewed thus far, this is my personal least favorite, and I'm overall feeling a solid 6 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.